Hello everyone, thank you for tuning into my video response to Synchronous Session 3 from October 9th, 2024. Today I'll be discussing the key topics that were covered during that session, addressing some of the questions that were raised by our classmates, and sharing my own insights, particularly how I'm applying these ideas to my research question. This week's session focused on how we can approach answering our research questions using two different types of research designs. One design will be incorporated into our research proposals, while the other one serves as an alternative method to explore. For my research question, which examines the relationship between grief severity and depression in bereaved individuals, I'll be discussing how this could be approached using a correlational design with a cross-sectional study as my primary design. I'll also touch on an alternative approach using a longitudinal design and compare the strengths and limitations of both. Key concepts covered in the session: summarizing main topics, quantitative research methods, and their connection to a post-positivist framework. So one of the first points that stood out to me was Dr. Robles' emphasis on the importance of feedback. She reminded us that we've all received thorough feedback on our research proposals and that we should use it to refine our work. I find this crucial because feedback is not only about fixing mistakes, but also about growing as researchers. I found that taking time to incorporate feedback has already helped me sharpen my research question and think more critically about my design. For instance, in my feedback, Dr. Robles pointed out that my research question needed more specificity. Originally, I had a broad question on grief and mental health, but based on her feedback, I did narrow it down to focus on the relationship between grief severity and depression specifically. This refinement not only sharpened my focus, but also allowed me to select appropriate measurement tools for these variables, which I might discuss later. So Dr. Robles also encouraged us to rely on textbook resources and to integrate knowledge from Dr. Falek's work. This struck me as an important reminder that while we bring our own insights into our research, we must also ground our work in established methodologies. Personally, I've been using these resources to better understand quantitative methods and to make sure that my research design is aligned with the best practices. Another key topic from the session was the focus on quantitative research methods. I've just become more interested and drawn to quantitative research because it does allow us to investigate relationships between variables like grief severity and depression in a structured, measurable way. But this session also made me think more deeply about the challenges of quantifying complex emotional experiences. For example, when measuring depression, I have to consider that depressive symptoms can vary significantly from one individual to another, based on factors like their coping mechanisms or cultural background. It's a challenge to balance the rigor of measurement with the depth of human experience, and I find that to be one of the more interesting aspects of this week's focus. Post-positivist approach. One of the things that really stood out to me during this session was also the discussion of the post-positivist approach to research. I found this concept particularly interesting because it encourages a certain humility in how we think about knowledge. It's a reminder that absolute certainty isn't possible, even in quantitative research, where we rely so heavily on data and evidence. For instance, in my study, even if I find a strong correlation between grief and depression, post-positivism reminds me that I cannot say for certain that this correlation exists in every population. Instead, I might report that results suggest a relationship between grief severity and depression in this sample, but further studies are needed for broader generalization. The post-positivist paradigm recognizes that all knowledge is probabilistic. We deal in likelihoods rather than absolutes, and that's why we use careful language like may or could in our research findings. This approach really resonated with me because it aligns with the complexity of the human experience especially in fields like psychology, where variables like grief and depression are so nuanced and varied. And again, Dr. Robles highlights the importance of using terms like may or could when presenting findings, because as post-positivists, we cannot claim anything with full certainty. So again, I found this idea fascinating because it allows us to present findings responsibly and with a level of caution. And it's an understanding that we are always working with probabilities and evidence, not definitive truths. Another good takeaway from the session was the emphasis on substantiating every claim with evidence from the literature. Dr. Robles reminded us that every part of our research, whether it's a variable or a hypothesis, needs to be grounded in prior studies. And this becomes crucial when designing our research proposals, especially when using quantitative methods where evidence is key to validity. During the session, there were some interesting questions posed by our colleagues or classmates. One of the key questions that was important or piqued my interest came from Tawana Smith, who asked how we can support our secondary research question using a literature review. So in response to this, Dr. Robles explained that both the primary and secondary research questions must be thoroughly backed by evidence from the literature. So when adding a secondary research question or variable, it's essential to explain why it's important to our study and what prior research has to say about it. So for example, in my study, if I decided to include a secondary question about the impact of social support on grief and depression, I would need to find relevant studies that justify the inclusion of this variable. Without the support, without the relevant studies to back this up, the question would just seem arbitrary, and it would even weaken the design. Also, clarifying the role of literature, Dr. Robles also stressed the importance of separating personal insights from research evidence. So while personal experience can inform the development of a research question, it's extremely important that the research itself be grounded in empirical studies. So in my case again, even though I might observe a connection between grief and depression in bereaved individuals that I worked with, I still need to back that observation with peer-reviewed research. Relating the session to my research question, discussing the relationship between grief severity and depression in bereaved individuals using a correlational design. Primary research design, correlational design with a cross-sectional study. So for my study, I plan to use a correlational design with a cross-sectional study. Let me explain why this design is a good fit for my research question. So correlational design is appropriate because I want to explore whether there's a relationship between two variables, which is grief severity and depression, without implying causality. I'm not manipulating these variables, rather I'm interested in seeing if they are related and how strongly they are correlated. Cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study allows me to collect data at a single point in time from a specific group of bereaved individuals. This is efficient for establishing the current relationship between grief and depression. So in my study, I would use tools like the Grief Experience Inventory to measure the severity of grief, and the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI, to measure depression levels. But using statistical analysis, I can then determine the strength and direction of the correlation between these two variables. Hypothesis. Based on existing literature, I hypothesize that there will be a positive correlation. As the severity of grief increases, levels of depression are likely to increase as well. However, since this is a correlational design, I won't be able to claim that grief causes depression, only that there is a relationship between them. Challenges of a cross-sectional design. While this design offers a lot of advantages, it also has some limitations. Number one, no causality. A major limitation of cross-sectional studies is that they can't establish causality. While I might observe that grief and depression are related, I won't be able to determine whether grief causes depression or if some other factor is influencing both. To explore causality, I would need an experimental or longitudinal design. Number 2, confounding variables. Another issue with cross-sectional designs is the potential for confounding variables. Other factors such as age, social support, or prior mental health history that might affect both grief and depression. For example, older adults might process grief differently than younger adults. This potentially affects depression severity. I plan to control for age statistically, possibly by including it as a covariate in my analysis. Exploring an alternative research design. Exploring the potential of using a longitudinal design for my research question. So while I plan to use a cross-sectional design, I'd also like to explore an alternative approach, specifically a longitudinal design. So a longitudinal design involves following the same participants over time and collecting data at multiple points, such as like 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year after the bereavement. This approach would give me insights into how grief and depression change over time and might help reveal causal relationships between the two. Also, it would allow me to track changes over time. So with this particular design, I could track how grief evolves and whether increases in depression occur after the initial period of grief. And this could provide more in-depth insights into how grief impacts mental health over time. And then there's also potential for causality. While still correlational, a longitudinal study offers more potential to make causal inferences because I could observe whether changes in grief precede changes in depression. So something that I wanted to mention in like this response to the session was one of the concerns. I know our data, like for Dr. for like that secondary data, but I think in the proposals or for future research studies to grant to obtain data, there's an ethical considerations that we have. So there is a sensitivity to participants' emotional state. Like in my case, if I were to run data collection, since grief and depression are sensitive topics, I'll need to approach data collection with empathy. I would include a mental health resource list for participants and ensure they understand they can withdraw at any time if they feel uncomfortable. Also, there's data privacy. Given the personal nature of the data, I use secure storage methods and ensure participants' responses remain confidential. Each participant would be assigned a unique ID to anonymize their data, which is essential in the grief and mental health research that I would carry out. And that was just, I wanted to add this in because in any type of data collection, of course, we have to go back and consider the IRB and proper collection methods. So in conclusion, this session has been extremely helpful in shaping how I approach my research. By using a cross-sectional correlational design, I will be able to efficiently investigate the relationship between grief severity and depression in bereaved individuals, even though it comes with limitations such as not being able to determine causality. At the same time, reflecting on alternative designs such as a longitudinal approach It has expanded my understanding of how different methodologies can yield different types of insights. So thank you for watching, and I hope this discussion has been useful in reflecting on our session and how it applies to our research questions.